In a forgotten village, a black couple struggles home after trying to salvage the last crops from land being destroyed by a luxury project. They found a man injured in an accident and without hesitation brought him into their home, offering him their only meal. They don't know he owns the project or that their kindness will save the entire village. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. Willow Creek had always been a quiet patch of land tucked away from the roar of progress. For generations, the small, tight-knit black community had endured, surviving droughts, economic depressions, and forgotten promises from the outside world. The land bore the scars of struggle and perseverance. A weathered wooden church with peeling white paint stood at the center like a stubborn relic of faith. Golden fields of corn bent under the weight of autumn winds. Old houses leaned against each other as if sharing burdens no one else would understand. Yet, despite the poverty that gnawed at the edges, Willow Creek held something intangible, a spirit woven through laughter, prayer, and the daily rituals of living. The latest change had arrived not with fanfare but with quiet brutality. Where children once dreamed of better futures in the newly built Willow Creek School, bulldozers now sat like hulking beasts on freshly torn earth. The school, the first within walking distance after generations of children trekking miles to distant towns, had barely stood a year before being sold off to a massive development company. The dream of education was flattened alongside the fields. The developers, armed with deeds and cold legality, began buying up land at prices that mocked the sweat poured into every acre. Promises of compensation dissolved into fine print. Crops ready for harvest were raised to make way for manicured lawns and luxury amenities. Farmers stood helplessly as the fruits of their labor and the homes of their ancestors disappeared under steel and concrete plans. At the helm of this transformation was Harold Whitmore, a name known in financial circles for turning forgotten towns into profitable paradises for the elite. 68 years old, Harold had built an empire on the belief that sacrifice was inevitable for progress. To him, nostalgia was a weakness, and survival meant adaptation at any cost. Yet Harold had never truly set foot in the world he dismantled. Not until now. Among those holding onto the frayed edges of Willow Creek were Bishop Carter and his wife Lorraine. Unlike the weathered elders that many assumed populated the village, Bishop and Lorraine were in the prime of their 30s, young enough to still dream fiercely, old enough to understand the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. Their daughter, Naomi, just 10 years old, was the bright flame they shielded from the encroaching winds of despair. Naomi, small but fierce, spent her evenings curled up with books borrowed from the fading library at the church, her mind reaching for stars she could not yet see. The Carters clung to their crumbling home, refusing to leave even as neighbors folded under the pressure. They watched the land change day by day, swallowed piece by bulldozers and surveyor flags, but their hearts remained rooted. Willow Creek was not just land to them, it was memory, blood, and hope stitched into the earth. Leaving it behind would be like tearing out a piece of themselves. And so, against the tidal wave of progress, the Carters and the few families that remained held their ground. Not with weapons or lawsuits they could not afford, but with the simple, stubborn act of staying. They carried the village in their hands and hearts, even as the world around them forgot it ever existed. The long walk home from town was a path Bishop Carter knew by heart, every rut and dip in the dusty road etched into his soles. His feet ached inside worn-out boots, soaked now by the gathering rain, each step squelching through the mud that clung to the ground like hungry fingers. He had gone to the county office hoping, foolishly perhaps, for justice, hoping the men behind polished desks would see reason and grant the villagers what was fair. Instead, he had been met with tight smiles, blank stares, and walls built from contracts and power he could not touch. The thin envelope stuffed in his pocket held little more than an insult, a settlement that wouldn't even cover the cost of seed for next season. Bitter frustration burned in his chest as he trudged along the narrowing road, the sky darkening, the first heavy drops of rain splattering against his face. The sun had already dipped low, casting long, bruised shadows across the abandoned road. As the village drew near, Bishop caught a strange sight through the growing mist. A silver SUV, sleek and polished, sprawled half-submerged in a ditch at the side of the path. Its frame bent and crumpled like a crushed can. Steam hissed from the engine, and the hazard lights blinked weakly, desperate against the swallowing gloom. Without hesitation, Bishop splashed through the muck, slipping and sliding toward the wreck. Through the cracked windshield, he could see a man slumped against the steering wheel, unmoving. His heart hammering, Bishop climbed onto the side of the wreck, wrestled the door open with grunts of effort, and managed to pry the stranger free. The man's head lolled, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, his clothes soaked and heavy. Whoever he was, wherever he had come from, none of it mattered now. Bishop didn't think about class or color or power. All he saw was a life hanging by a thread. Grimacing against the effort, Bishop half-carried, half-dragged the man out of the ditch and onto the mud-caked road. The stranger was heavy, too heavy for Bishop to manage alone over the long distance to the village. Bishop knelt beside him, rain soaking into his jacket, and looked up the empty road once more. No cars, no distant lights, only miles of dirt and swamp in every direction. The nearest hospital was nearly 30 miles away, across roads that were little more than mud rivers after the storms. Even if he could somehow flag down a passing driver, which seemed unlikely, there wouldn't be enough time. The man needed help now. Bishop wiped the rain from his brow, made the only choice he could, and dragged the stranger's limp body to the side of the path. Breathless, he paused, scanning the tree line through the driving rain, and then did the only thing he could think of. He ran. The village was closer than town, but still a punishing distance on foot, especially in the worsening storm. Bishop's lungs burned by the time he burst through the creaky gate of his small yard, rain streaming off his jacket. Lorraine appeared on the porch, alarm flashing in her eyes as she saw the desperate look on his face. "There's a man wrecked up the road," Bishop gasped out. "Hurt bad. I need the cart." Without a word, Lorraine ducked back inside and emerged with the battered wooden handcart they used for hauling firewood. Together they raced back down the road, Naomi trailing anxiously behind, before Lorraine shouted for her to stay put. In the driving rain, they reached the stranger again. Gently, carefully, they lifted him onto the cart, Bishop at the head, Lorraine steadying the wheels behind. The cart groaned under the weight as they pulled it along the muddy path, Bishop leaning into the strain, Lorraine panting through clenched teeth. The rain turned the earth into treacherous sludge, the cart's wheels sticking, sliding, threatening to topple. Twice they nearly spilled their unconscious burden into the muck, but stubborn will pushed them forward. Step by grueling step, they wrestled the man toward the faint light of their home, a flickering beacon against the encroaching dark. By the time they stumbled onto the porch, soaked to the bone, exhaustion painted their faces pale. Naomi peeked out from the doorway, her small hands pressed against the frame, eyes wide with fear and awe. Without ceremony, Bishop scooped the man from the cart and carried him inside, laying him down on their sagging couch, as Lorraine rushed to fetch a rag and a chipped basin of water. The tiny house was dim and cold, the fire barely flickering against the wet wood Bishop had managed to gather that morning. The ceiling leaked steadily, puddles forming on the cracked floorboards. Yet within these frail walls, kindness moved with a strength that no storm could wash away. Lorraine knelt by the stranger's side, dabbing gently at his wound, her touch tender and sure. Bishop stripped off his rain-soaked jacket and hung it by the hearth, muscles trembling from the effort of the rescue, but heart steady with the knowledge that they had done what was right. Naomi hovered nearby, her school books forgotten in her arms, watching the scene unfold with wide, solemn eyes. She did not know yet what this night would mean, how deeply it would carve into their lives. She only knew that a man was hurt and that her family had answered without question, just as they always had and always would. Outside, the storm raged, beating against the battered home as if trying to tear it apart, but inside, beneath a roof patched with hope and nailed together with stubborn grace, a stranger drew shallow, shuddering breaths, and the first fragile threads of something larger than any of them could yet imagine began to weave quietly through the night. The night deepened around the tiny house, the storm clawing at the roof and rattling the patched windows with every furious gust. Inside, the fire struggled against the damp, sending out weak tendrils of warmth that barely reached the edges of the room. Bishop sat hunched in the battered armchair, his hands folded, his boots caked with dried mud from the night's grim work. Lorraine knelt quietly beside the couch, gently dabbing at the stranger's bloodied temple with a piece of cloth dipped in cool water. Naomi sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, her school books spread before her, writing intently by the wavering light of a stubby candle. The shadows shifted and danced on the peeling walls, making the little house feel at once smaller and larger, like a vessel caught between worlds. Hours passed this way, wrapped in quiet tension and the relentless drumming of rain. The man on the couch stirred now and then, lost in fevered dreams, but always settled back into uneasy sleep. Lorraine and Bishop moved around him with careful hands and steady hearts, saying little, needing no words to share the burden between them. It was some time past midnight when the stranger finally woke fully, his eyes fluttering open to the dimness, confusion clouding his gaze. He tried to lift himself, grimacing in pain, but Bishop was there in an instant, a steady hand pressing him back down. "Easy, now," Bishop said, voice low and sure. "You're safe." Carol Whitmore blinked up at him, struggling to make sense of the faces, the place, the rough edges of the world around him. His gaze drifted over the sagging walls, the threadbare furniture, the puddles pooling on the cracked floorboards where the rain leaked through the roof. His lips parted slightly, but no words came at first. Lorraine moved closer, setting a small wooden bowl of steaming, watery porridge onto a crate beside the couch, then retreating again without ceremony, her hands folded anxiously at her waist. Harold shifted, wincing, and after a long moment he rasped out, "Thank you for helping me." Bishop only nodded, silent, his expression unreadable. Naomi looked up from her schoolbook then, her small voice steady and kind in the hush. "You should eat, mister. It'll help you feel better." Harold gave her a faint smile, more an instinct than an intention, and reached for the bowl with both hands. The porridge was thin, almost translucent, with only a few grains floating in the watery broth, but its warmth seeped into his fingers, grounding him somehow. He took a spoonful, then another, though every bite brought a strange, aching tightness to his chest. After a few spoonfuls, Harold glanced around again, his brow furrowed. He noticed for the first time that none of them, Bishop, Lorraine, Naomi, had any food before them. Only him. Only the stranger. He hesitated, the spoon halfway to his mouth, then lowered it carefully into the bowl. "Aren't you all eating too?" he asked, voice hoarse but puzzled. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. Bishop leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on Harold, and for the first time there was a crack in his guarded manner. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the rough stubble on his chin as if weighing how much to say. Lorraine glanced at Bishop, then busied herself with straightening the worn quilt draped over the man's legs, saying nothing. Finally, Bishop spoke, his voice stripped of anger or self-pity, offering only the plain weight of truth. "Ain't much left," he said simply. "Last bit of rice in the house went into that bowl. Thought it ought to go to the man who needed it most tonight." Harold's grip tightened on the bowl. His mouth opened, but Bishop raised a hand slightly, quieting him. "We'd have had more by now," Bishop continued, his voice low and rough. "Would have had a full bin of fresh grain by next week. Harvest was ready, but they tore up the fields." He paused, glancing toward the window, as if he could see through the rain to the broken land beyond. "Said we had to move out. Said the land was sold. Paid out pennies, then sent in the bulldozers." Naomi's pencil had stilled on the page. She hugged her knees to her chest, listening with solemn, ancient eyes. Bishop's voice grew softer but sharper somehow, each word carving deeper into the silence. "School's gone too. They built it just last year, after years of fightin'. Kids finally had a place close to learn, but now the school's boarded up, ground marked for a golf course. Most folks in the village got nothin' left. No land, no work, no place for the young ones to go. He looked Harold in the eye then, not accusing, not pleading, just stating a fact as heavy and cold as the rain outside. All we ever asked for was a chance. A little patch of land to call our own, a place to grow our food, raise our babies, teach them how to hope for better. Harold sat frozen, the bowl of porridge cooling in his hands, the words sinking into him like stones tossed into a deep, still pond. He thought of his own people back in the city. Executives in boardrooms, lawyers with gleaming pens, surveyors sketching new boundaries onto maps without ever stepping foot on the dirt. He thought of the contract signed with a flick of his wrist, the hollow assurances that progress was coming. He had never asked whose progress, he had never cared. And now, here, in this crumbling house lit by a single flickering flame, among these strangers who had given him the last of their food without question, Harold Whitmore felt the full, raw weight of what he had destroyed. Naomi shifted slightly, drawing her schoolbook closer, picking up her pencil again with determined little fingers. In the soft glow of the candlelight, she bent her head low and began to write, the shadows of her dreams stretching long across the worn wooden floor. And Harold sat there, silent and still, knowing for the first time in a long, long while that he had been wrong. Not just about Willow Creek, but about everything. Dawn crept over Willow Creek like a whispered apology, pale and hesitant, streaking the storm-swept sky with faint hints of gold and pink. The rain had stopped some time in the small hours, leaving behind a world washed raw and silent, the land sodden and battered but somehow still standing. Inside the little house the fire had long since died to cold ash, the single candle had burned itself down to a stub, its smoke curling like a ghost into the rafters. Harold Whitmore lay awake on the worn couch, staring at the sagging ceiling, feeling the stiffness in his ribs, the ache in his head, and something deeper still. A weight pressing against his chest that no bandage could ease. He rose slowly, wincing, and found his shoes by the hearth, still damp from the night before. He slipped them on and stood there for a long moment, taking in the room again. The cracked walls, the patched chairs, the simple dignity in every object carefully placed not for beauty but for need. Bishop sat by the window, already awake, sharpening an old knife against a whetstone with slow, steady strokes. Lorraine moved quietly in the kitchen corner, boiling what little water they had left for a thin tea. Naomi slept curled against the wall, her schoolbooks tucked protectively against her chest, her face peaceful in the fragile light. Harold cleared his throat, his voice rough in the morning stillness. I should be going," he said. Bishop looked up briefly, gave a small nod, then returned to his task. Lorraine offered a tired but kind smile, one that asked for nothing, one that forgave without demand. No one tried to stop him. No one asked for anything, not even his name. That somehow cut deeper than any accusation could have. Harold hesitated, fumbling for words, but there was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound hollow against the truth of what he had seen, what he now knew. He murmured a thank you, awkward, inadequate, and then stepped out into the bruised morning. The air outside was sharp and cold, carrying the damp scent of wet earth and crushed dreams. Harold stumbled a little down the porch steps, the stiffness in his body a mirror to the stiffness in his heart. He walked slowly back toward the ruined road, where already a few men were gathering around the wreckage of his SUV, their voices low and curious. Some of his own staff had finally found him, their shiny trucks spattering mud as they pulled up to the scene, their crisp clothes and worried faces so out of place against the wounded landscape. They clustered around him, offering concerned questions, apologies, promises to get him back to town, to a hospital if needed. Harold said little. He let them guide him into the back seat of a gleaming black vehicle, leaned his head against the cool glass, and watched Willow Creek recede behind him, small, battered, and stubborn against the horizon. The drive back to the city blurred into a fog of pain and reflection. His mind replayed the images of the night: Naomi bent over her workbook, Bishop's steady voice recounting the loss of the land, Lorraine's hands pressing a cool cloth to his forehead without judgment, the thin, watery porridge offered without hesitation. By the time they reached the towering glass offices of Whitmore Development, Harold's decision was already made. 3 days later, the people of Willow Creek gathered in front of the battered church at the heart of their village. Word had spread that men were returning, trucks rumbling up the muddy road again, but this time something felt different. Bishop stood near the steps with Lorraine at his side, Naomi clutching his hand. Her dark eyes wary and curious. Men, women, and children emerged from their homes, from the fields, from the shadows of uncertainty, and stood together in a loose circle, bracing themselves for more bad news. Then Harold stepped forward, alone, wearing no suit, no polished shoes, just plain work clothes and an expression carved from humility and regret. He moved slowly to the center of the gathering, the villagers watching him in silence. He cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on his shoulders, but this time he did not hide behind polished words or corporate veneers. "My name is Harold Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying through the crisp morning air. "I am the owner of Whitmore Development. I am the man responsible for the project that has brought pain to this place, for tearing up your land, for closing your school, for stealing things I didn't even bother to understand." There was a low murmur through the crowd, a ripple of shock, anger, betrayal. Bishop's jaw tightened, Lorraine's hands clenched together, Naomi's eyes widened. Harold raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady himself. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice rough with the truth. "I saw this village only as numbers on a page, land to be bought and sold, without seeing the lives, the history, the hope rooted here. I cannot undo what has been done, but I am here to tell you, before God and all of you, that I am sorry, and I intend to make it right." He stepped back then, letting his words hang in the air, waiting for the judgment he knew he deserved. It did not come with shouting or violence. It came with a heavy, skeptical silence, the kind that said he would have to earn back every inch of trust he had shattered. And he intended to. Work began that same morning. Harold had brought teams not of lawyers and surveyors, but carpenters, roofers, builders, ready to repair what greed had broken. One group set immediately to work rebuilding the Carter home, reinforcing the walls, patching the roof, installing real windows to let in light without the rain. Another team cleared land near the heart of Willow Creek to lay the foundation for a new school, Willow Creek Hope Academy, funded not by charity, but as a solemn debt owed to the future Harold had tried to steal. Harold canceled the expansion of the resort. The golf course plans were burned, not filed away. He pledged to protect the land that remained, working with attorneys to place Willow Creek under historic preservation status, ensuring no future developer could touch it. He established a fund for the farmers who had lost their fields, enough to replant and restore their harvests, enough to breathe life back into soil scarred by machines. Chunks were offered to the young men and women of Willow Creek, not as an apology, but as a partnership, with contracts written in plain words and promises backed by actions. And Harold stayed. He did not vanish into boardrooms or leave others to clean up his mistakes. He rolled up his sleeves alongside them, hammering nails, hauling timber, planting seeds. He shared meals with the families he had once displaced. He listened. He learned. Weeks later, as autumn began to soften into winter, Harold stood quietly at the edge of the new schoolyard, watching Naomi and the other children race across the grass, their laughter lifting into the crisp blue sky. Bishop stood a few feet away, arms crossed, still wary but no longer closed. Lorraine sat nearby with the other mothers, sewing uniforms for the children who now had a future again. Naomi caught sight of Harold and, with a smile that forgave more than he deserved, waved at him, her hand high and certain. Harold lifted his own hand in return, his throat tightening. For the first time in his long, hollow life, he felt something solid and real take root inside him. Not the cold satisfaction of conquest, but the warm, aching truth of redemption. And there, under the open sky of Willow Creek, Harold Whitmore finally understood that true ownership was never about land or titles. It was about belonging. It was about taking responsibility for the lives that touched yours and choosing every day to do better. Years later, long after the last nails had been hammered and the final seeds planted, Willow Creek stood not as a memory of survival, but as a testament to something rarer: restoration. The field stretched golden once more under the wide-open sky, the church's weathered steeple casting a proud shadow across the earth, and laughter drifted from the sturdy walls of Willow Creek Hope Academy, where children now recited lessons and built futures without fear of being uprooted. The land, once marked for erasure, breathed again with the stubborn, beautiful life of a community that had refused to disappear. Harold Whitmore, older now, his hair thinner and silvered with time, stood once again at the edge of the schoolyard, a familiar, quiet figure that had long ago ceased to be a stranger. He leaned on his cane, the years weighing on his body but not his spirit, and watched the new generation of Willow Creek run free across the grass he had once threatened to pave over. He came often now, not as an overseer or benefactor, but simply as a man who had chosen to stay, to atone not just with money but with presence. He had built no statues of himself, named no buildings in his honor. His redemption was not etched in stone, but sewn carefully into every brick, every beam, every harvest. Naomi Carter, taller now, her face bright with youth and determination, raced past him in a blur of motion, a satchel of books bouncing against her hip. She was no longer the small girl scribbling by candlelight, but a young woman full of fierce intelligence, a scholarship recipient bound for college in the fall. The first in her family's history to go beyond the borders of Willow Creek, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She spotted Harold, skidded to a stop, and jogged over, her braids swinging behind her. "Hey, Mr. Harold," she said, her smile warm, easy, the kind that had long since dissolved the invisible walls between them. Harold smiled back, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Off to change the world, are you?" he teased, his voice roughened by age but still rich with quiet affection. Naomi laughed, the sound clear and strong. "One step at a time." He nodded, his heart full. "That's how it's done." Behind them, Bishop and Lorraine sat on the church steps, hands entwined, watching the village they had fought to save bloom around them. Bishop had aged, silver threading through his hair, his movements slower, but the steady fire in his eyes remained undimmed. Lorraine's laugh still rang out when Naomi said something clever, a sound that filled the air like a hymn. As Naomi ran off to join her friends, Harold turned his gaze back to the horizon where the fields swayed gently under the soft breath of the wind. He thought of all the choices he had made, the roads taken and the roads repaved, the damage once done and the healing still in progress. Redemption, he had learned, was not a single act. It was a lifetime's work, a daily tending of the soil you once scarred, an endless choosing to be better even when it would have been easier to forget. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers, the low hum of bees, the distant shouts of children at play. It was not the roar of construction he had once thought was the sound of building a legacy. It was this, the small, steady symphony of life restored. And standing there, cane in hand, heart full, Harold Whitmore finally understood something deeper than any business deal had ever taught him. True ownership was not about possession. It was about stewardship. It was about leaving something behind that could grow without you, thrive without your name carved into it, live and breathe long after you were gone. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields of Willow Creek, and Harold remained standing, content to be just another root woven quietly into its soil, part of something far greater than himself. Something pure and enduring and finally right. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.